Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Casey Plett's collection of short stories, A Safe Girl to Love. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will kick things off tonight with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. Also from the Free Press, we have our literary editor, and also drinks writer, Ben Sigurdson, joining us in the host seat. We also have John Toews from McNally Robinson. He does the event coordination there. And we have Charlene Diehl from Thin Air Writers Fest. And we also have our author, Casey Plett. Then Charlene, John, and I are streaming to you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I will pass it off to Charlene for an introduction, and then Casey will take it away with a reading, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to them just when we can. After our discussion today, I will introduce you to our October pick. And with that, over to you, Charlene.
This is when I remember to turn my mute off, as opposed to yapping away and making no sound. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this wonderful conversation. This is a very exciting time of year for us at the festival. Thin Air kicked off on Wednesday the 20th, and it runs through till mid-October. And we have 63 amazing writers featured of that long lineup. One of the wonderful writers who's part of our group this year is Casey Plett. So I was really delighted to be part of kind of scheming to have Casey as the featured book for this particular gathering, because I'm a huge fan of her stories and her fiction and her being in the world. All of you on this stream now probably have read this beautiful reissue, A Safe Girl to Love, which was a first book, both devastating and beautiful in my mind, and to many others as well. She has also written Dream of a Woman, Little Fish, and has edited Meanwhile Elsewhere, science fiction and fantasy from transgender writers, and is on the verge of producing, and I don't know if anyone else has seen this, it just came in the mail today, but
I have it.
You have it, Ben? Okay. One of the great things about like hanging out with books is like, woohoo! So a brand new collection of nonfiction called On Community. So Casey's won a ton of awards. She comes from Southern Manitoba and sort of spends her time dashing between Windsor and New York. She's a publisher, a huge community figure, an inspiring presenter, and an all-around important member of our extended and up-close community. And the last time she was here, she was presented with her own beautiful photo at McNally Robinson, and it made us all cry.
Yes, totally. John, was she the last person to receive a coveted spot on the McNally Robinson wall?
Yes, I believe Casey is the last floating head that's actually gone up on our wall. So.
What?
Pretty exciting. So welcome, Casey. We're so glad to have a chance to be in your company.
Thank you, Charlene. It is wonderful to be here, and thank you, Nadya. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, John. It is lovely to be doing this, and thank you all of you in the live stream who are tuning in, or if I am also speaking to you, perhaps in the future, if you are watching this on recording. And thank you for being here as well. Try to read a little bit from the book. Okay. So I'm going to read just a few minutes from a story called Portland, Oregon. All you need to know about this story to begin is that the protagonist's name is Adrian, and she lives alone, sort of. You can hear me okay? Yes, also? Awesome. She slipped back into the apartment around 8 when the woman had said they might call her again and leaned her frame against the wall. When she stood upright, off-yellow paint flakes were on her coat. She took it off and shook them out and went into the kitchen to heat up soup. Soon she was back in her armchair. The cat wandered over and lolled on her feet. He was deceptively large. He looked average-sized enough as he walked, but when he sat on his haunches, his weight spilled from his sides like pudding. He leapt onto the armchair and filled in the space like caulk between her and the headrest. She stroked his head and she murmured. She said, "So I was a bitch this morning." "Slightly," he yawned. "I suppose I deserved it. I did pee on the floor." And she said flatly, "Yeah, that was kind of gross. Were you drunk?" He cleaned the back of his paw. He spoke enunciated and carefully. "Maybe," he said. "You did leave the lid down." And she said, "Glenn, please go in the bathtub. I will like that a lot more than you going on the floor." And he said, "Fine, I won't do it again." "Okay, okay." She blew on her bowl and she said, It's frosty in here. Hey, will you be okay with the winter? Because I could get you a heater." She nodded to him and slurped and she said, I can do that." "No, not at all, Adrian. You see, I am a Norwegian forest." "I know you're a Norwegian forest, dude." Well, he said, I just need you to understand. I don't wither easily." She scratched under his chin. "Tough kitty." "You sure? But I mean, you can tell me these things. I want you to be comfortable here." And Glenn closed his eyes and sighed out with a high pitch that sounded like a wheeze. And he said, "I will let you know if I am cold. I wouldn't suggest worrying about it, however." She nodded quickly. Then she ate her soup rapidly and he fell asleep. She gave Glenn a little kiss on the side. The black stripes on his fur bruised when his body rose with his breathing. She tried to crane her neck to look at the phone in her room. She really wished they would call. She tried to get up without disturbing him, but he woke up and he said, "Ugh." And she laughed as always happened. She said, "Whatever, man. Like you need more sleep." She put the kettle on. "You want any tea?" "I've never had tea," he said. "Oh, it warms you up better than rye or whatever it is you like to drink. You like rye, right?" "Piddle," he said. He came into the kitchen, leapt onto the counter, and then the fridge. "And yes, that is what I prefer. And actually, sure, I'll have tea. I've never had it." How did you grow up how'd you grow up without drinking tea? Weren't your owners all snobby?" And he said, "My former humans drank scotch and hot chocolate. Well, and rye whiskey, but not, in fact, tea." She said, "My kind of family. No, absolutely not." When the kettle went, she put a tea bag into a bowl and poured the water in. She was almost a tea, too. She went to check her answering machine just in case, and nothing. She sat on a chair in her room. Then she picked a pillow off the floor and hunched up with it on her knees. The woman had told her what they would pay per call, and she had counted on making that much soon. But if they didn't call her in the next couple of days, and then Glenn yelled, "Adrian, this is far too hot. I can't drink it." She came back to the kitchen and blew on his bowl a bit. "Here," she said. "Thank you," he tentatively lapped it up. "This is remarkably tasty," he said. "Is all tea like this?" And she grinned and bobbed the bag in her mug and said, "No, there's thousands of different kinds, actually. This one would be called English breakfast." "English breakfast." Glenn kept his nose in the bowl. "Yes." "Do the English really drink this for their breakfast?" He continued laughing, and she drifted to the window where snow had just begun to fall. "I don't know, Glenn," she said absent-mindedly, staring up through the glass where she could almost make out the flakes hitting the ground. "I really don't know."
That was an amazing reading. Yes. Whatever you do on Zoom, silent applause. So I was reading along with you and I was following and sort of watching you jump around in that passage. And I found it so fascinating and sort of, this was not where I was going to start, but I just, it was so interesting hearing you reading that passage, but conversation between a cat and its owner. And I have questions about voice. I have questions about Glenn. I have questions about short stories in particular, but you were it sort of felt like you were sort of skipping a little bit ahead and sort of rearranging things and almost remixing things as you went along. Is that something you do on a regular basis, or is it something? have a little bit to do with sort of the fact that these stories are older, or maybe sort of you think about them differently, or they come across differently sort of when you read them out loud?
Yeah, totally. So I do that all the time. And if you have not read this book, I did not read word for word what was on the page. I do that all the time, and I started doing that when I started to notice that there were readings where I would do, and I would read from a book, and I would start to like dread a part, and I was like, oh, I don't want to read that. I don't. And then I was like, oh, but I wrote it, so I can just not. Like it's mine.
Yeah.
And I kind of started to think about it, how like, some musicians will, I mean, not that I consider what I do to be music or acting, but I felt somewhat inspired by, like some musicians will kind of like change up how they play a song kind of every night or whatever. And so that to me just sort of is part about how like I can, I've done hundreds of readings by now in my life, and that sort of keeps that enjoyable. I also had a very hilarious moment. When was it? It was like, so there's a lot of very rampant profanity in most of my books. And one time I was invited to do a reading at the Mennonites Writing Conference in Winnipeg. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, the literary Mennonite crowd is usually a pretty salty bunch, so I'm sure it's fine. But my reading was scheduled during a CMU donor evening. And right before I went on, I was like looking at like what I was going to read, and I was like, oh, and I wanted the host. I was like, it's so like, it's okay if I just like, well, there isn't like lots of swearing in it, is there? And I was like, oh no, like, so that was quite a what do you call it?
I don't know.
That was the apotheosis of such a thing. But I had to do my own audiobooks. I did the audiobook for this, and I also did the audiobook for A Dream of a Woman. And one of the interesting things about doing audiobook is that you have, I mean, like, the director will stop and make you redo it if a comma sounds like a period. Like you have to do exactly word for word what you wrote. And it was interesting how different of an experience that was, because that felt more like labor, I guess, in like the sort of like strict sense of the word. Like, okay, I'm being paid for my time to go literally kind of like read these things word for word. It did feel like a fun, I guess it felt like acting versus perform versus like playing music, maybe. Yeah, that's a very long answer to your question. But.
No, that was great. And we do have a question, or we do have an audience or a reader question that doesn't mention the audiobook, just sort of tangentially or whatever.
Cool.
But we'll get to that in a little bit. I know you touched on this a bit in the afterward, but can you talk a little bit about how this collection came to be, and also maybe while you're doing so, sort of what it's like to revisit it, so many years later when it's being republished?
Yeah, how it came to be is pretty simple. I was working on a lot of nonfiction at the time, and I was very focused on trying to write these like serious essayistic things about being trans, and I was very like invested in it. And I was very sort of tangled up in knots over it. And then I wrote a couple short stories, and one of them was published, and I was like, oh, you know what? I like this. Like, and I was very quickly just kind of became like, this feels more energetic to me. I think I'd rather be doing this. And then, but approaching it like 10 years later, yeah, because this came out in 2014. And a really funny thing happened when I went to revisit it. So it was last summer 2022, when, I go and pick up the old version. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to reacquaint myself with this old thing. And I was kind of dreading it. Probably in the way that like any of us, if you like had like a big thick amount of like stuff that you had made a decade ago, you would be a little wary to kind of like go splunking around in it. And sure, there were parts in it that I read and I was like, okay, I do that differently now. I wouldn't write that now. And there were also parts where like, hey, like this is good. Like, man, have you heard about this book? It was kind of funny. But I think I was also a little disturbed how ready I was to sort of pass judgment on that former part of myself. Like I was dreading rereading this work. And I think about some other writers who will speak about their younger work in ways. I'm not going to name names. I don't want to shit talk anybody on something that's being recorded, but I have definitely read like established writers who've been around for a while talk very dismissively about their initial younger work, and that almost sort of seems a little sad to me, and also maybe a little disquieting. Especially, I think maybe this is a thing about writers too. I feel like I hear this more with writers, where we sort of castigate younger writers and be like, oh, well, you're not old enough to sort of like, I don't know, like lived man and made good work. And you get a pass if you can trot out some really terrible, horrible trauma card, and which of course is also messed up. Um, and I read this book, and again, yeah, part of me was like, okay, I wouldn't write that now. Like I would do this differently if I was doing this again. But also I couldn't, even if I wanted to. I could not like write this book. If I really like set out to do something like that, I would make up something different. I was hearing like different music back then when I was younger. So it was very cool and refreshing to spend so much time with this whole thing. But one thing that did sort of come to me is that I was just sort of like a replenished wish to treat younger writers with a little more seriousness.
Yeah. I love that that answer for 100 different reasons, but one of them being because you were talking about music before, and it's like there's really a tendency for a lot of bands to either get back together or revisit a classic album, an album that people love, and they play it front to back. And they, I often have wondered the same thing about those kind of things as you were talking about with your book, where you're revisiting it and you're like, oh, there's some things where you might not do again or whatever, but at the same time you revisit it and you're like, you know what, this is actually kind of cool. So it sort of does tie in very well to that sort of whole line of thinking. John, you've not said anything yet. I feel like you should at least get in here and say something and make sure your microphone's still working. Or Charlene, I have lots of questions. So.
Oh, I did actually have a question that might build on that a little bit as well, because now that there's officially kind of like a Casey Plett View Askew universe out there, and there are all these characters that have repeated in so many different works, I was wondering how it felt to you as the author to actually go back and meet these, like in some cases, younger or more formative versions of the characters that we followed through. Because I know just as a reader, like going back and encountering Sophie again for the first time, like that was a gut punch just from a reader's perspective. So as the author, how do you feel that your relationship with those characters has grown, and how has your treatment of them been?
And maybe I'll before you start, I'll just jump in and let readers know that in your other works, other characters do reappear from time to time. And so if you're interested in any of these, I don't know why I'm pointing to my book. Oh, because one of your books is right up here. But if you're interested in these characters and how some of them develop, I would definitely recommend sort of continuing into the Plettiverse, if you will. And yes, there you go, John. He's got them handy right there. So anyway, sorry, go on.
Thank you. Yeah. It was a little melancholy, especially rereading the character of Sophie, just because of how her arc goes in my novel Little Fish. And one thing I think that felt very important to me about that was to not be too consistent. Like one thing that felt kind of nice is to revisit some of those characters and be like, okay, yeah, like it's this person who shows up in this other book and shows up in this other book. But also there are a lot of differences just because, well, people change over a lot of years. And so you can still recognize them, but they're like different versions of themselves. And that even actually, I would say, happens within A Safe Girl to Love, where the character of Sophie shows up in the first story, but then she also shows up in a later story. And she's a much different person. Not like much different, but like I've always imagined her that like some stuff happened in the interim few years of us meeting her that draws out different aspects of herself. And I always just thought, I don't know, I always thought that was really fun. I thought that was fun in the way of like TV shows. You know, you'd be like watching a show and there'll be like sort of like a secondary character, and then we don't see that character for a few episodes, and all of a sudden they pop up again, maybe in another context, and you're like, oh, whoa, check it out, it's Jeff. Like, I guess Jeff runs a pizza shop now. Like, I can sort of see Jeff doing that. That's wild. Wow, his wife is a piece of work. Like, good, okay, you know. And then like Jeff maybe disappears again for a few episodes, but then he shows up later. Like, I find that really compelling. And even you can go like years. Like, are any if anybody's a Buffy the Vampire Slayer person out there, there is there's a character who's like a main character for like 3 seasons, Oz, who then leaves in a really like painful, tearful breakup. And 2 seasons go by without I think him being mentioned at all. And then the character of Xander just like makes a joke once where he's like, I miss Oz. He'd get it. He wouldn't say anything, but he'd get it. Oz was like very laconic. And that also makes sense that you just like wouldn't hear about him for a while and then there'd be a callback to him. So I always think it's very natural to just like, it feels very natural to me to have recurring characters and just sort of like checking on people once in a while. I don't know if I'll always do that, but like maybe I will. And then the other thing also with my books, I mean, is like so much of my fictional work is about like, it's specifically about trans women of a certain age, of a certain like experience, mostly all white, although not all, and like pretty much all millennial, except though not all. And so my point is that like, it makes sense that they would know each other, or that these people would sort of like show up in each other's lives, or sort of like pop up here, pop up there, kind of like, and also like take place mostly in the same sort of like group of cities. So like, it always just seemed to me like, well, yeah, like it's totally reasonable that this person would happen to be in this bar when who we know from story X when Y and Z show up. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Charlene, do you want to jump in with anything?
I'm going to pop in here and say, when I hear you sort of frame it like that, Casey, and I wasn't really thinking of this when I was reading, I was just sort of wandering through all these places, but I wonder if this kind of connects with your larger idea about community, because all of these characters may or may not necessarily know each other, but they offer us an opportunity to enter a community that we know is fictional, but feels very real. So I sort of wonder if that's part of just how how the Plettiverse works, that it is a very large community.
If only there was a short book of nonfiction that we could reference.
Right? It's weird. I just got one in
my only. Oh goodness, really? Really? And if only it was very like affordably priced and could fit into one's pocket quite easily.
It's very
perhaps. You can probably read it pretty quickly.
We'll come back to the shilling of new books near the end, but yes, I'm interested in this, the answer to this as well. So
yeah, I would say so. I think I'm also very intrigued by like the history that these people would have for each other, and like the histories certain communities do, and that can cut across a lot of different kind of lines. So with trans stuff, I mean, like, it would make sense that some of these people might like know each other, have met each other, have a history with each other, and perhaps even go like years without speaking or happening to run into each other. And it sort of being this sort of like very natural, organic thing. And certainly, I mean, like, I think about that. And then I also think about like, my mom and stepdad are both from the Steinbach area. And I remember we like went out there for like, Christmas once years ago, and they like, and I hadn't been there with them for like quite some years. Like I had been there independently, and my mom and stepdad had gone back to visit independently, but we were just at the concert, and then I think somebody, there was like the woman who's did a solo on one of the songs. I was like, oh, she's really good. And then my stepdad's like, yeah, she's been doing that at this since I was in junior high. And I was like, what? And like, I don't know, I don't think he's talked to her for years, probably hasn't, probably never will. Just like, yeah, that person. I'm very fascinated about these kind of like meat and potatoes things of community where you're like, well, yeah, that person. Duh.
I love that.
Can I just ask a little
Oh,
follow-up?
absolutely. Yes.
Next to a different thing I was thinking about as I was reading and moving from, I really love story collections. I really love stories. I think it's actually a very subtle form and not easy to handle well. And I think these stories are so potent. And I kind of move between feeling delighted and amused and kind of in pain and worried and amazed by their courage and, concern for their self-destructiveness and all of it, right? And I think what I wanted if you would talk a little bit about, which connects to my question about community, is that we get to move through so many different individuals, and all of your individuals are so well drawn and have such a clear, specific feel and sound. And I think in some ways, this is part of how I experience the collection as a kind of community, because I know I'm moving in and out of different people's homes and families and relationships and inner struggles and meeting their cats and their friends and, the people who crash overnight, sometimes for too long. But I feel like there's a very clear specificity to each of these stories, so that we have a really strong sense of kind of the granular feel of each character or each of the characters in a story. And yet as a whole, they all kind of resonate with one another and talk to one another. And I'm sorry, that's not really a question, but could you just talk about that?
Thank you.
That's my gig. When I'm usually the one who rambles on for a long time and then says, "Oh, that's not actually a question." But
this is what happens when you invite me here.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, like, I'm not sure I'm not sure I have anything to add. I mean, like, you're right, and that's like that. It means a lot to hear, because that is sort of how I feel about these characters as well, and what I hope for them. But I don't know if I have anything to add. I think that, like, I'm also very intrigued by how, like, I think the majority of our human interactions day to day, lots of us, are, we can have like family and friends and coworkers and people who we, care deeply about. But if you think about like the actual sort of like given, like in like a given week where you have to interact with the people, most of that is, I wouldn't like, with other people in our world who I don't know if I would use the word strangers, I don't know if I would use the word acquaintances. Neither of those seem quite true. And I think the thing that interests me about those things is something that maybe is like captured by this idea of community. I remember I was like, when was it? It was like summer, I think, of 2021. And I had gone back to visit my old pals at Biblioasis, where I used to work. This office in Windsor, and I went into the corner store that across the way. And the guy at the corner store was like, "Oh, it's you! Like, how's it going?" And I was like, "You have no reason to remember me," but he did. I don't know if that's really an answer to your comment. It's not really a question.
A non-answer to my non-question.
Yeah, it's perfect. John, do you have anything you want to jump in with immediately? Or I could take something. Or...
No, I did, and I don't know if this is just me projecting onto the collection, which I'm always afraid of. But one of the things that
I welcome those things. Please project away.
Project myself fully. But one of the things I really noticed this time while rereading the book was how much so many of the stories hinge on moments of like loss of self, either in a positive or negative way. Like I'm thinking, I was really pleased to read Disconnection, Portland, Oregon to start, because Adrian's disconnection in that is so vitally important to the narrative of that story. Whereas so many of the other characters often do really find themselves or make important discoveries in moments of abandon. Like I'm thinking Lisa and Tam and How Old Are You Anyway? or like when Lizzie is watching Annie dance, and Sophie's moments with Mark, or just even imagining the youth imagining themselves as Mimi and Roger in Rent. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, like loss of self and disconnection and abandon, and how self-discovery can result from that in the stories, if that isn't too much of a ramble.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I always remember when, so with Bill Watterson was talking about Calvin and Hobbes, comic strip Calvin and Hobbes featuring a 6-year-old who is Calvin, and then his friend who is a tiger. And if, as readers of the strip will know, when Calvin's just alone with Hobbes, we see Hobbes actually like talking and walking and doing stuff and getting into trouble. And he's drawn differently. He's drawn as an actual tiger, but anytime there's an adult around, actually anybody besides Calvin at all, he's portrayed as a stuffed tiger. And Bill Watterson wrote about that, and he was like, the number one thing people want to ask me is Hobbes real? And he was like, I'm just like not, that doesn't interest me. I'm not, that's not, I'm not concerned about that at all. Did you get that? I think it's like someone cut up for a second. Okay, cool. And so narrowly with Portland, Oregon, I mean, that's why I thought the same thing about Adrian and Glenn. Like, is Glenn real? Is Adrian imagining these things? Well, I mean, I'm not sure that really is the important question, because I think that even in a world in which, like, okay, Glenn is real, we live in a world where cats talk and hang out, Adrian would still be going through the same level of disconnect and the same level of pain and the same sort of level of like questions. And so and I think maybe there's a mirror there with the other stories. Well, you might notice as well, Portland, Oregon is the only story where the character is not explicitly identified as trans, although Adrian is trans. And what I think like, John, with what you were talking about, if there's a driving force that unites all these stories in that respect, a lot of it is about these people who they transition, and that's supposed to sort of like be like, okay, I kind of figured myself out. I like figured out these enormous things, I did this huge thing. And then it turns out like, oh no, but now there's all these other things, and you actually still haven't really figured yourself out at all, because there's all this other just sort of like general real life stuff that you also now have to confront. And that maybe ties into a little bit like self-discovery being sort of like an ongoing, like ever-present process. It's a little subtle, but in one of the last stories, Winning, the only character where we have a trans character who's a lot older, who transitioned a long time ago. And even though in some ways she's a bit of a stick in the mud and a bit of kind of like really set in her ways, I think we also see her change as well throughout the story. And that's something that is like, she is like continuing to kind of like figure out, especially with, with her relationship with her daughter. So yeah, I don't know if I have anything like additionally like illuminating to say about that, John, but like, you're not wrong. That stuff is all on my mind all the time with my work, and it probably always will be.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Charlene, you got anything you want to jump in with? I can always jump in with questions. I've got a couple of reader questions here as well still.
I'll just have one tiny one that kind of follows from what John was saying. One of the things that that happens between the speaker and the cat is this kind of mirroring, where you sort of see you almost see a person finding themselves through their connections with whoever they are relating to. And sometimes their relationships are really fraught, and sometimes they're glancing, and sometimes they're very deep, and sometimes they're very interior, like Glenn. It doesn't, as with Hobbes, it doesn't actually matter if Glenn likes tea or worries about English breakfast tea, because it matters to the shape of the story. But I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is I think it might be in the manifesto piece, and I've forgotten if it's actually called manifesto, but
called Real Equality Manifesto. Yeah,
it's sort of about the, I guess, the different, or the distance between being special or marked or kind of identified in a certain way, and being just a muddling, mixed up human like everybody else. And I feel like the invitation into all of these trans lives is extremely generous and exciting, but also so all of these characters are so familiar, because I think we all talk to our cat, you know, whoever that is for us, you know, our friends, our partners, our children, our cats. I mean, the stories kind of map out that feel of trying to be in relationship, even if you're just on your own, and trying to muddle along and be a real authentic self, and not somebody who has to represent something on behalf of some kind of specially identified group. So again, there's a nice question mark. There's no question mark anywhere there, but it's me observing, it's like the beauty of this, and also the invitation. And I do want to say how generous it is to be invited in. And I felt like you make a home for those of us who are not trans, and who know and or maybe don't know. It's an invitation, and it is so critical at a time where it's all over everywhere, that it's so, the temptation to identify a group, especially trans right now, and just kind of identify, put a target on there and say, well, we don't want that. And like that is this, you know, I think that's what your writing does over and over again. That it's not about the difference. It's about the connection and the sameness and the recognition.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. Sorry, if you did, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more than thank you.
Is there a question that you wanted me to respond to?
That's okay. I'll give you another I'll give you another non-question. That's fine. And it'll just float there in the oblivion awkwardly, as I'm prone to do. I think one of the things that is so incredible about your writing is the dialogue and the voices. And I think that always draws me into any great writing. And they're just audible. I mean, and not only, you know, when reading it, you can sort of hear them in your mind, but then when you read them, they were just as visceral and just as unique, you know, between cat and human. Yeah, I don't know. And is dialogue something you struggle with? Do you enjoy doing it? Is it something you find comes easily? Are you one of these writers who sort of says you're an eavesdropper and sort of grabs bits of dialogue from conversation? This is sort of getting back to sort of logistics of writing, I guess, versus, you know, specific themes or whatever, but it made me think of it.
I remember when I was like, I think I was like 19, 20 as an undergrad, and I was like exchanging stories with a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, and we met to discuss, and I sent them something, and they were like, and they did not think that the dialogue that I've written was organic at all. And I just remember one of them be like, I don't know, listen to people, how people talk, and like, and I mean, she wasn't wrong, but I also, it is like very important to me, yeah. And I think one thing that was really key for me, I remember started to think about like very stylized dialogue, like dialogue that is like really kind of like snappy, punchy, and bang, 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 but like doesn't necessarily sound how humans talk. And I think I understood something really clicked for me when I realized, like, okay, that's so cool, that's fine. Like I think a good example is like Miranda July's short stories, which are like, I love reading Miranda July, but also like her stories don't really sound like weird average humans just kind of like blabbing to each other. Or I think about like, I mean, this shows you what age I was when I was thinking about the movie Juno, for example, you know, like Diablo Cody stuff. That's like, or I don't know, Gilmore Girls, not a great example. And like, I just feel like, okay, like that's what I don't think that's what I want to do. I think I want to, I think I want my dialogue to sound unstylized, but I also really want it to sound real. I really, really want it to sound like people talking, which is really difficult. There's an old Grace Paley saw that's like, dialogue is not conversation, dialogue is conversation's greatest hits. One thing I've ended up doing a lot is that I will like write out dialogue like word for word, including how people would say, including like, yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like this, I guess, right? Hey. And then I will do that later, and then I'll kind of like pare it down afterwards with the hope that what remains is something that actually sounds like people talking to each other. I'm really grateful you think that. But it is, yeah, it is really important to me. Also, I don't know. Sometimes I see a bunch of description pile up and like my brain just starts swimming a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. I need to get to at least, well, a couple reader questions before we run out of time, because readers are why we're here. I mean, I would love to get together on Zooms with all of you on a regular basis, but for this purpose, I'm I know I'm gonna horribly mispronounce this name. Yuta Wasaki says, Ms. Plett maintains that some of her experiences come from lives of her friends. What has been the response from her friends who have read her stories? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Most people, I mean, like, specifically when, say, friends of mine recognize, like, oh, is this kind of like based off this person? Was like, oh, you're basing off that one time I was there for that. Funny. It's mostly, I mean, I'm mostly blessed for it's just been positive, you know. There's, I think most of my friends kind of like know the deal and get that. There was one time where in my latest book of fiction, A Dream of a Woman, where there were two friends of mine who were fictionized very closely and very clearly, and also who people who knew them would know them, and I sent it to them ahead of time. This is the only time I've done this. So I was like, hey, this is happening. You know, do you have any feelings about that? Like, I can, you know, and also if you feel like, I mean, it's fiction, so it's true is complicated, but like, does this feel, if anything does not feel true or fair to things, you know? And they read it and they're like, no, it's okay. I think that it's mostly, I don't know if I have an exciting answer. I've mostly been very fortunate that my friends have been very, very kind about such things. And a lot of the times too, it's been transformed enough, I think, where, you know, some friends will see like, oh, okay, that's kind of like this, but I have no idea what this is about. So like, whatever.
I like that you did that, because there's at least a few occasions in this book where you describe people doing exactly this. And as every time I saw that on the page, I thought, like, I know exactly what that looks like, because I do it all the time as well. Like, I don't know.
All right.
So moving on.
Not understanding what's going on, a very shared experience, Ben.
Oh my gosh, it's like it's my touchstone. Okay, so another reader question from Jamie Dolanchuk. I loved Casey Plett's book, bought it, and also downloaded the audiobook. And on a trip from Minneapolis to Winnipeg, I listened to the whole thing uninterrupted. This is it's like it could be right out of the book, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Using locales that appear in the book. I also bought a copy to send to our daughter in New York, and one to her godmother who lives in Winnipeg. My question throughout the stories, did you intend any common themes, or did any emerge as you were writing the book? It's a big, so lots of interesting specifics into a big picture question, I guess.
Yeah, definitely there have been times when I didn't really realize what I was writing about until I had written it. Like, there have been definitely times when I've written a lot about grief where I didn't understand that I was writing about grief until like a lot of it had formed, and I kind of went like, oh, okay, like this is what I'm doing. Okay. And I would even say, like, maybe in this first book, I think after I'd written like a bunch of the stories, I'd started to realize like, oh, some of this is about accepting some things that'll never be fixed. Like, that there is no, and I would also definitely say that about Little Fish, my novel, where like this is about like, oh, like there actually is not a solution to this, and this actually is not going to get better, and this actually is just like not, maybe won't even change. It's and there are characters that are like really like struggling to come to terms with that. I would say those are things that I didn't necessarily realize until I was sort of like in the thick of writing them, for sure. There was some stuff where I kind of like set out ready to like, okay, I want to write about this, and I'm going to write about all this. So for example, Winning is a really clearly like, it started out with about like, what if there was a trans woman whose mother was also a trans woman? Like, wow, that would be wacky. Oh man, that would be messed up. So like that was like pretty, you know, clearly from the get-go, like, oh, I'm going to write about this. Okay, I'm going to do it. So it's sometimes cut and dried, but often I think one of the exciting things about writing fiction is that stuff ends up revealing itself to you as you're doing it. I'm trying to work on a novel right now, and like that process is happening again. Like, oh, okay. I had to spend like tens of thousands of words with this weirdo to understand that like this is what I'm actually trying to do. Like, who knew? Incredible.
Okay, so I was going to ask sort of, oh, Nadia's just popped back on, which means we're almost out of time. So probably now is as good a time as any to sort of ask what you're working on right now, as well as to mention that you will, if for anyone who wants to hear more about Safe Girl to Love and about On Community, which you can talk about for a couple minutes if you want. Casey will be here on October 7th at McNally Robinson's Grant Park location. As part of Thin Air, the Winnipeg International Writers Festival. But I did want, sorry, that was an early play. I was going to do that right at the end, but I did want to ask you sort of about.
You could do it again. The LBJ scenario, just like
I'm just
driving it home.
Yeah, I'm just warming up. So you sort of talked about Safe Girl to Love, Little Fish, and Dreams of a Woman being sort of a trilogy, and that they all felt sort of somewhat a piece of the same idea, as you said. And your most recent book, On Community, coming out next month, I think. Mm-hmm. But there will be some at your launch next week, October 7th. Anyway.
Like a week and a half, yeah,
something like that. It's nonfiction. So like I was going to ask, do you see yourself writing more nonfiction, branching out into different areas of fiction? But you're obviously working on another novel. Mm-hmm. And ...
Yeah, writing nonfiction is too hard, man. You have a career in it. My hat's off to you. I've been a fiction writer, or I've been a publicist, which of course is also kind of like fiction writing. And so like I have this novel that I'm trying to kind of like pick out again, and another story collection is maybe sort of like waiting in the wings somewhere, bubbling up.
You don't have to give specifics, because I know that writers generally hate to do that because it's just like a curse or something.
Oh, you are very correct. You're totally true. It's like saying the Scottish play in the theater, name of the Scottish play in the theater or something. But with the On Community book, yeah, so that's my first book of nonfiction. And it came about because actually talking about like being revealed to oneself. I've always like sort of like thought about community within my work, although never super front and center. And I've always thought about it being super complicated and like really, really tricky. And also this kind of like really fraught, like emotion-filled thing I didn't want to look at too closely. And it was actually when someone interviewed me for A Dream of a Woman, and I ended up saying some things that I think were fairly cynical about community as illusory, and community as this very sort of like shifting fluid to the point of like meaninglessness thing. And I read those quotes back in that interview, and I was like, oh man, like I sound super cynical and almost nihilistic here about community. I mean, like, yes, community frustrates me, but I don't know if I exactly feel that way. But yet I said these things. Like something's going on there. It was also the summer of 2021. So, a time when lots of us had been extraordinarily isolated from community for a long time. And the idea of reconnecting with it was like super, super fraught and complicated and possibly dangerous in all these ways. So I kind of decided, like, I think I want to unpick this idea. And then I spent 2 years doing it. And that was very difficult. I'm very glad I'm back to making shit up now, man. Way, way better.
2 years for that little book. Are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, buddy.
No, it's fantastic.
I also
And
judged the Giller in the interim and read a lot of fiction.
okay, rub it in. I'm just kidding. John, Charlene, do you have anything you want to jump in here with before Nadya?
Do we have time for another question, or is it? One more question? Well, I don't want to monopolize, but the only other question I had was just about, this is one of the most tactile collection of short stories that I've ever read. And so I just wanted to talk about your way of depicting or the importance of touch and human contact, speaking and building it on community a little bit. In a very half-handed way, because there's like, I think in Trust, of the moment where a woman is calming herself by holding her own body, or at the end of Not Bleak with the warmth of the computer. And there's one just beautiful bit of writing in How Old Are You Anyway, which is where I'm going to do the most obnoxious thing and read back somebody else's prose to them.
Oh no, and it's that one. That's like the porn story, man.
You brave soul. Part.
Okay, great.
The feelings of touch that had acted so dark but clear, lantern-lit maps, but now she was feeling the traces of these directions steadily floating away, like these beautiful depictions of touch and tactility in the writing. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I found it really fascinating this time out going through the book.
Oh, that's super cool. Thanks. I don't know if I've even thought about that before. Maybe something that's helpful is just what I was reading at the time. I think I was reading stuff at the time where this was like really heavily on my mind. Tamara Faith Berger, I had just started to read her work around this time, and she is like super like, wow, like I feel like I learned about like so much about writing touch and sex through reading Tamara's work. Chandra Mayer, I had like just came to her work and I was like, oh, okay, like aha, I'm starting to understand some things about how you can do this in books. At the same time, I think I remember I was reading Raymond Carver for the first time, who's so like minimalist and detached and very like, but also like so emotionally intense. So I think, yeah, that stuff was on my mind. And of course, I mean, like these questions of like transness and being in touch with one's body or not, and this question of like dissociation or like not. And I think I was curious about that interplay. I'd also just read Nevada by Imogen Binney, which I would say is a very not tactile book. And I'm a lifelong Nevada stan. I don't say that as a fault of the work. I say that as in like, oh, that's what the book is doing. The book Nevada is very much about like not having any tactile sensations whatsoever, and the idea of like an interchange between sort of like in one's body, not in one's body, in one's body, not in one's body, and how touch corresponds with that. Yeah, it was on my mind. Although I've never actually articulated it before or really thought about it that way. Thanks, John.
No, you're welcome. It's fantastic. Like even those moments where characters are just sitting in the park and looking at their hands or lightly rubbing their fingers as well. Like it struck me so much when I actually clicked.
Totally. Charlene, do you want to bring us back around? Talk, anything you want to add or anything like that before we wrap up?
I do want to invite everyone in a more formal way to Casey's event at McNally Robinson next Saturday, the 7th.
Yes, please come.
Starts at 7, and she'll be in conversation with Jonathan Dick, that's going to be a splendid matchup.
And we may mention him again at some point this evening as well.
We might. So yeah, that's happening next Saturday. And I would just, for those of you who are here in Winnipeg, I would say find yourself a little copy of our swank little program. It has a calendar of all the events, which are spread over most of a month. So we're no longer doing the 50 events per day sort of route. We're doing a nice, long, slow marathon that spreads over a much broader space. We are also going to be doing some daytime stuff. So for those of you on the stream who have been agitating for some daytime activities, we're doing book chats again, Tuesdays and Thursdays starting tomorrow for the next 3 weeks. So we've got pairs of writers at the library, downtown Millennium Library. So there'll be lots of conversations, quite a bit like this, which is a beautiful way to find your way inside a book. I always think of a conversation about a book being kind of like a companion to reading a book. It just kind of opens spaces and gives you new access. And if you get to talk to a writer about their book, you also get the voice and the cadence and all the way that writing character gets channeled through their characters in turn. So I'm so glad that you're part of Thin Air this year, Casey. And
Thank
that
you, Charlene. Thank you for having me.
on the screen, but also that we'll get to see you in person. Very much looking
Yes,
forward to
you may be the only author who gets 2 events.
it. Might be
Goodness gracious.
One of the few.
one of the few. Well, you are very special.
Thank you. Thank you. Privilege and an honor.
I'm trying to think, was there anything else you wanted to mention about Thin Air before we throw to Nadya? Oh, yes, we got to talk about next month's book, I guess, too.
Yes, I think you can find out anything you want to find out about the festival at thinairfestival.ca. And I guess I would just say briefly that we do have a really big digital component. So most of our writers have also created these cool little original videos that are on their writer profiles. It's a great place just to wander around and maybe find some of the books that you want to read this year coming up, because there's some doozies in there. And thanks for inviting me. I really liked being here.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I guess with that will do it for tonight. Thank you all so much for the fabulous discussion. To introduce our book for next month, it's a graphic novel called Shelter Belts by Jonathan Dick, who is from Winnipeg. Our meeting for Shelter Belts will take place right here on our YouTube channel on Wednesday, November 1st. So it's October's book. But it's happening November 1st to account for Halloween, and it will be at 7 p.m. Our meeting will feature Dick along with arts reporter Eva Wodsney and our friends from McNally Robinson, of course. We appreciate everyone who has tuned in with us tonight. So thank you all for reading along, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, John. Thank you, Nadya.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
Bye.